Welcome to the All Axxess Entertainment Podcast. I am your host, Joseph Bruen. With me this week, a legendary figure from a legendary family, somebody who means a lot to me for sure, a wrestling historian. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Ross Hart. Ross, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be on, Joe.
Absolutely. It's great to have you here, and I got to first and foremost thank Mr. Bob Johnson for connecting us here. And it's just a privilege to have you here. So thank you for taking your time.
My pleasure, Joe.
So let's get right into it. I guess going way back to the very beginning, obviously you grew up in a wrestling family. This was, through the bloodline of your entire family. But growing up as a child or a young adult, what were some of your very first memories of pro wrestling?
We lived in a big household with 12 kids, but the office was front and center, on the third floor, sort of in between the bedrooms, which was kind of interesting. And my mom was working there all the time, answering phones and kind of communicating to my dad, when the wrestlers called about their bookings or, maybe getting their checks. But everything that dealt with wrestling was front and center in that room, that office. And my parents were there most of the day, handling phone calls, dealing with wrestlers, other promoters, bookers. So, that was my first experience with wrestling. And then visually, I think it was when I started watching it on TV. Our TV show was on every Saturday, and it was usually from the tapings the night before at the Pavilion in Calgary. And I used to look forward to watching that every Saturday. I can remember watching it from when I was maybe 5 years old, and it was great. There were just so many impressionable stars, Sweet Daddy Siki, Don Leo Jonathan, Carl Gotch, the Fabulous Kangaroos. And it was incredible. And so I watched it on TV for a year or two, I think from about the time I was 4 till 6. And then finally, when I was in grade 1, I think when I started elementary school, I was allowed to go to the live matches on Friday night, as long as I was kind of under supervision of Brad or Dean, my older brothers, So those were my first recollections of being exposed to wrestling.
And what were some of your earliest conversations that you can remember that you had with your dad about the wrestling business?
My dad was pretty guarded about wrestling. He didn't want his kids getting too consumed with it because it could be a distraction. And, he really wanted us to focus on school and being well-rounded. So he didn't share a lot of information. It was more sometimes what I observed or picked up on, or sometimes I'd be eavesdropping on conversations he was having with my mom, or his phone calls, with different wrestlers. So as I got a little older, he shared more information with me. But my dad was, protective of the industry, and he didn't want us really knowing the real images of wrestlers, because that could sort of shatter our beliefs, or the ones that were role models to us, and some of the villains or heels that we were kind of terrified by. But I think my dad would sometimes rein us in if we were taking it too seriously or going overboard with it. And so then he would, just kind of subtly say, it's okay, I've got control of these guys, and you don't need to worry about that. So he had a great awareness, my dad and my mom, of what our impressions were, and to make sure that didn't go overboard, that was too extreme, that it would, affect our interactions with other kids in the family, or focusing on school and other things. My parents wanted us to be involved in other sports and activities, and not just too consumed with wrestling.
And when did you first get into the training yourself? and kind of maybe walk us through a little bit of that training, what went into it.
Um, I started training with my brother Bruce. Bruce was just a phenomenal teacher, a really good instructor. He had great communication skills, and he he was so complete and extensive in what he taught. It was so much about psychology, but really emphasizing the proper basics. How to land. Tucking your head in and breaking the fall with your hands and your feet. How to go into the ropes and how to project yourself to the audiences. But I think maybe after I graduated from high school and I was in university for a couple of years. There's sort of an opportunity to do some wrestling. I was going to a lot of the shows in other capacities, sometimes looking after the gate receipts, the financial proceeds, and settling up with the sponsors or the arena managers. And I was going to a lot of these shows anyway, so it kind of just dawned on me, maybe I can be wrestling because I'm going to these shows anyway. So I started training with Bruce, I think maybe when I was about 21, 22, and he was teaching a few other guys. I remember he was a really big influence on my brother Owen. And Owen's first exposure to wrestling was through Bruce, and he was training a few other guys as well. But and usually that would be in my dad's basement, or sometimes the ring was set up outside when the weather was nice, and that was nice because we could really elevate our training and do more rope work and more aerial stuff than we could in the basement, where it was very low ceiling and we had no ropes, and it was only about 6.5 foot clearance there. So that was nice when we were able to go outside. But I think when I started training with my brother Bruce while I was in university, and I was just kind of looking at my options about what I wanted to do, but I don't think I ever seriously considered I was going to do it full time. I just figured I would explore it and see how it went. And I'm glad I had that opportunity because even though I didn't go as far with the wrestling end of it, like Owen and even Bruce and Keith prior to that, and of course Brett, I had a pretty good idea of what the roles were in a match, as a baby face and a heel, and how to project yourself to the crowd, and everything, Bruce taught psychology, body language, facial expressions, and how to get yourself over and your opponent. And Bruce was just very thorough in what he taught and trained there. But I picked up a lot of things, even from my dad. More about the submission wrestling though, and how to defend yourself if you had to, against somebody that imposed his will on you or challenged you. It could be an opponent in the ring, or a heckler, or somebody who just didn't take wrestlers very seriously. So I did learn a lot from my dad as well, and I'm quite blessed that I had that exposure to different influences, and all were very positive.
And the Hart House itself, basically, that you guys all grew up in, kind of took on a life of its own and kind of became a whole other Hart family member, and it's just become an iconic piece of history. What was it like growing up in the Hart House itself, and any memories you could share of living there?
I could I could write a whole autobiography just on my experiences in the house, because we had 12 kids there, 8 boys, 4 girls, and all the different interactions that were going on there. Even though a lot of it was kind of influenced by wrestling, and that was our livelihood, and wrestlers coming and going from the house and watching the TV show on the weekends, and going to some of the live shows, especially, I would go to the pavilion shows every Friday and then watch a TV show the next day. But all the interactions, my sisters really spent a lot of time with my mom. When the boys all went to the wrestling shows, quite often on Fridays, my dad would be at the shows in Edmonton on Saturdays. My sister spent that time with my mom, and it was great. They would do baking or arts and crafts, and they would watch TV shows, and it was kind of nice. It was their their time together with most of the boys doing something else. We might have been playing football or out biking or something, but my sisters spent that time with my mom, which was great. But all the different interactions and the age gaps, there was probably over a 20-year age gap between Smith, the oldest, and Owen, the youngest, and all those different interactions that were going on. And yet my parents were in strong control. They were watching very carefully and, making sure that there were no issues, no conflicts. When there's 12 kids, there's going to be conflicts and disputes sometimes. I'd never say there was bullying or anything like that. Most of us, I think, were well raised, but sometimes there would be issues, especially with some of the males or the boys. And my dad took a very strong hand in disciplining and dealing with that, and if you're out of control or misbehaving or causing problems for other family members in schools or for teachers, or other family members at home and teachers at school, my dad was very punitive, and sometimes he was very physically intimidating and punishing, and that's sort of the way kids were raised then. Parents had more physical control, and they could get away with more than what they can today. My dad ruled sort of with an iron fist, but at times he needed to keep control of the family and really instill values and morals and proper behavior in all his kids. So we loved our parents, but we very much feared and respected my dad. If he had to deal with discipline issues.
Yeah. And when it comes to, your late brother, Owen, obviously he has such a great reputation of being such a good man, and obviously such a great technician in the ring. But behind the scenes, he's, of course, known to be one of the great pranksters with the ribs in pro wrestling. When all of you boys were growing up and you get all the boys together, was he often the instigator? Was it like that all the way along?
He learned a lot of his pranks from Bruce and Dean, his older brothers, and they were just masters at pranks. Not so much with the family, but sometimes schoolmates, people, kids that were riding on the school bus with us. And I think Bruce and Dean maybe learned that mischievous side, maybe, from a few wrestlers that were around. And sometimes they'd hear stories from my dad about the Mabel parties and some of the pranks and ribs that went on. And Bruce and Dean were quick to pick up on that. And they were master impersonators, and they could instigate and get people going at each other. And they could. And Dean was sometimes a little more on the shady side. He could sometimes swindle or take advantage of people, but for the most part, it was really just in fun. But Owen picked up so much from Bruce and Dean as he grew up, and I think became a master charmer, but prankster and ribber. Picking up the best antics from Bruce and Dean, and then Owen kind of carried it on in the family. He would pull pranks on his brothers and sisters. Sometimes my mom and dad. He would call sometimes from the basement on one of the lines and get my dad on the office line, because we had two different phones. We didn't have cell phones or anything back then. Sure. And be impersonating like a salesperson or a telemarketer or someone. And my dad was already quite on edge, kind of dealing with the day-to-day dealings with the wrestling and wrestlers calling and getting the guys to the shows, and dealing with all the stress of that, guys not showing up, or someone being late, or some wrestler had an issue or problem. So my dad had to kind of handle all those issues, my dad and my mom. But Owen would be in the basement calling from the home number to the business line, and then get my dad on the phone and be impersonating a salesperson. And my dad had no idea it was on, and Owen would be speaking in a very low voice and saying, "Hello, sir. Can I just have a moment of your time?" My dad would say, "I don't have much time right now, as I've got a business to run." And Owen would say, well, "We're kind of going through our product inventory, Mr. Hart," and then his voice would get lower, and my dad would just get so mad. He said, "Speak up, for Christ's sake! I can't hear you," and then this conversation would be going for a few minutes, and then finally Owen would just burst out laughing because he couldn't hold it any longer, and my dad would be just furious and slam the phone down and say, "Owen, you bastard! Wherever you are." Owen was usually hiding in the basement where my dad couldn't reach him. But he would fool my dad all the time like that. As he was growing up, but always very harmless pranks. Never that hurt somebody or really ultimately embarrass someone. But he would always get you. Owen. He was always innovative, and he would come up with something new. Because if you did the same prank over and over again, you wouldn't fall for it. You'd say, "Oh, Owen, you've already done that." But he would do different things. And then as he got older, he became a little more savvy, and he could do it from other places. He didn't have to do it from the house where he was living, So sometimes he would do it when he was long distance somewhere or from a hotel somewhere, and call and get my dad going. There's just so many instances of that. The famous one was where I think they were at a wrestling pay-per-view somewhere, and Reg Parks, who had worked for my dad for many years, was there. I think Reg was just a guest at the show, and maybe he was showcasing some of the wrestling belts that he had made. And anyway, Owen from the hotel called my dad's room because my dad was a guest there, and called as Reg Parks. And Owen could do such a perfect impersonation. Just about anybody. He could impersonate anyone from Vince McMahon to my dad. Or different wrestlers, and you could have no idea. There was just somebody mocking them, and he called as Reg Parks to my dad's room. "Hi, Stu, how are you? How's it going?" And then my dad's, "Yeah, not bad, Reg." And then Owen would start the conversation about, "Well, Stu, when I was breaking in with you many years ago, you took a lot of liberties with me, and I don't appreciate that. And you put me through a lot of anguish, and you didn't need to." And my dad would say, "Well, Reg, you're kind of breaking in, and it was the way that guys were taught. So, well, you wouldn't do those things with me now, Stu." He said, "You wouldn't dare take liberties with me." And anyway, it kind of went on for a few minutes, and then the tone became a little more confrontational, where Reg was actually challenging my dad, and at least to my dad's eyes. And so, Stu, if you think you want to test me now, let's get it on, And my dad saying, for Christ's sakes, Reg, if you want to piece me, I'm not that hard to find,
Right.
Instance, after several minutes, my dad was, initially patient, and he never. My dad was never the overreactive type, but after this went on for several minutes, and Reg kind of attacked his demeanor and personality, my dad finally just had enough. Say, "Reg, if you want to piece me, then you should have let me know." And then Owen just burst out laughing, and as soon as my dad heard the laughter, he knew right away, this is that goddamn Owen. He got me out of town. He got me at a wrestling show, out of Calgary. But he was just incredible, and then he pulled a lot of these pranks with wrestlers in hotels, sometimes calling from the front desk to somebody's room, or maybe from a food vendor calling somebody and saying, "We have a special on a Domino's pizza," or something like that. And he would get these guys rooms back then. It was easier to access rooms. Now there's so many security protocols you have to go through to even dial somebody's room. But Owen was constantly pulling pranks and ribs on unsuspecting wrestlers, and getting them agitated, and nobody could figure it out, that it was Owen, and until the very end. But yeah, he was. I think it was a way he kind of coped with the stresses of the wrestling industry, and having a little fun, and not taking it too seriously. And that's what I always liked about Owen. But his initial influences, his funny side definitely came from watching his older brothers Dean and Bruce in action.
Now, was Owen ever able to get one of his brothers, or was it more so just your father?
Oh, he got all of us.
Oh, he did.
Yeah. I think he called me one time as an insurance salesman or something, trying to sell something, and and I had no idea who it was. And another time, he taped a part of a conversation. My sister Ellie was upset about how Jim was being treated in the WWF, and Owen was able to take the recording from Ellie's voicemail to him, and then played it on my voicemail. And I thought, well, why is Ellie calling me with this message about Jim and how he's getting screwed around by the WWF? And but Owen just took that recording and then played it on my voicemail. And then I called Ellie and I said, Ellie, did you leave a message for me? About Jim? And she said, no, I never did. But she had left one for Owen, because Owen was working for WWF at the time, and she thought he could be sort of a mediator and help Jim get back on track there. And but anyway, Owen used to do things like that all the time, and you'd never suspect it. And he was quick. He was very quick-witted and spontaneous. And he always knew how to capitalize on somebody's innocence, I guess, or their naivety, and but I think for almost all the wrestlers, he created kind of a fun atmosphere, in spite of the long trips and the stresses that went with doing the TV tapings and long interviews, and sometimes having issues with other wrestlers or agents or bookers. And Owen was constantly pulling these pranks and ribs, but he was also a very positive influence in the dressing room. Guys liked having him around because he always brought the best out in you. Owen would always say, hi, how are you doing? And just a great person to have in the dressing room. And I think Brett, to an extent, too. Brett was great for his drawings, his animations. He would draw a picture of Jay Strongbow or somebody, or some of the different wrestlers. It could be Hulk Hogan or Andre the Giant, and it would just make people laugh, and just kind of eased the tension that a lot of wrestlers were going through with the heavy travel schedules and the injuries, and trying to keep their sanity with the crazy schedules that they're on.
And a great friend of the Hart family, of course, is the late, great Harley Race, Hall of Famer. Any stories of Harley interactions with you guys or at the house?
Harley was classic. He wrestled several times when he was the NWA World Champion. He was really the top star of the world at that time. The NWA had the most exposure, I guess. It covered the most areas throughout the world. So what I liked about Harley is he was just a great person. He never looked down on anybody, even though he was a major champion, and he would come in and do great business. His philosophy was always to make whoever I'm wrestling in the ring look like they could beat me, and have a great match, whether Harley snuck a win on them or it went to a 60-minute draw. But Harley was great. He would come up and visit my dad sometimes. He was not aloof, like some champions who just went to the shows, did their business, but really wanted their privacy. But Harley was very approachable. My dad would schedule the world champions for a lot of media and press coverage during the Stampede, because those were our big shows during the Stampede Festival in July. And my dad would always bring in the world champions, or maybe Andre the Giant, and maybe midgets or females, and some other attractions. Are really the biggest shows of the year. And then my dad would bring the world champion to all these important press appearances, like the Hayes Breakfast, the Stampede Breakfast, which had the ungodly time of starting at about 6 a.m. and then take them to the grandstand show, where they'd be introduced to all the guests at the rodeo, where there'd be 20,000 people in the stands, and get exposure before the wrestling shows on the Fridays. So poor Harley, he would be out partying the night before. Harley always enjoyed just cutting loose after the matches were over and going to a a bar and ordering drinks. And Harley was very gracious. He would be buying rounds for everybody. Sometimes it would be a $500-600 tab, and Harley was buying shooters and drinks for everybody, and up till about 3 a.m, and then had to be up around 5:30. My dad would pick him up, rustle him up out of the hotel downtown, and poor Harley, was hungover and hadn't even had 3 hours sleep, but he never let my dad down. He knew Stu was counting on him to make these appearances and introduce himself to the fans and really plug the shows. But he was just nonstop, Harley. I couldn't believe the energy level he had. He partied, he smoked. He wasn't in the gym working out, but he was a constant professional. And night after night, he was out there having great matches. Even though I think his body was feeling the effects. Some of the bumps he took and the headshots he took, and he was just such a giving person. Not only to the guy he was wrestling with, but the promoter he was working for, the fans, even though I think it took its toll on him, after 30, 40 years of that lifestyle, but that's what I always remembered about Harley. He was just classic in that sense that he gave his all, but really on his terms, right? And, and he was very approachable, would do anything that a promoter asked of him. And I couldn't say that about Andre the Giant or Luthez or some of the more conservative attractions, who really didn't want to take that extra step, without getting paid extra for it, or they just wanted their privacy, or they, in Andre's case, he didn't like being exposed as an attraction because he thought he was sort of being exploited like a freak. And sometimes he wouldn't do it, and Andre was sort of the same as Harley Race. He loved to be out at night and ordering rounds, and Andre was pretty generous. He would quite often pay the tab, just to have those people around him and nice girls that surrounded him. But he sure didn't want to be getting up at 6 a.m. to make appearances for my dad, and that was sort of the difference between him and Harley, and Andre wasn't giving in that sense, and he didn't like being exploited. He didn't like being classified as the eighth wonder of the world or a unique attraction or a giant, because it made him or set him apart different from other wrestlers, and yet, with guys like Harley and even Dory and Terry Funk, they did everything they could, to make the shows a success, and put in the extra hours with the PR and appearances, because they knew it would translate to a bigger show, a bigger gate. And, that's what I really admired about, the Funks and Harley Race when they defended their world championships in Calgary.
Yeah. One of the famous parts of the Hart House, of course, is the dungeon, or maybe one of the infamous parts of the Hart House. So, the legendary dungeon. What are some of your personal memories of the dungeon?
It was sort of my dad's sanctuary away from everything else that was going on in the house, having to deal with 12 kids, all the comings and goings, of the wrestlers, running the office, dealing with all the phone calls during the day. And sometimes then he would go out on his errands, he would make bank deposits and things like that from all the proceeds, from the gates. He'd usually do that Mondays, and he was always kind of on a strict schedule. My dad at times wouldn't come home right away. My mom would say, after you finish the deposit, you come home. And my dad would be kind of out at the scrapyards looking for metal and pieces he could build more wrestling rings with. So it was kind of interesting. But so his day was always very full, and in the evenings, at least a few times a week, he'd like to go in the basement and work out. He would do weights and cardio. He would do some Hindu squats and you use the weights. Just basic bench press and dumbbells. But that's where he would work out, and then he would train with some of these aspiring wrestlers. If guys wanted to break into wrestling, my dad would say, well, if you're really serious about it, you come up some evening this week, like Tuesday or Wednesday night, and and that's where we'd work out with these guys. But a lot of them never got that far. The sessions with my dad were so punishing because he always did the submission wrestling. He would tie these guys up and put them in grapevines or thread throughs, and humble them pretty good, and for my dad, he wanted to teach these guys respect for wrestling, and it wasn't just something they could get into, overnight. He really wanted them to learn the art of submission wrestling, and a lot of them never came back, after a few sessions. And my dad did this really so they had respect for wrestling, and I think a lot of them he knew really maybe wanted to get in for the wrong reasons. They maybe didn't have the athletic ability or the real passion for it that some wrestlers did, and the best way to convince them is, well, you go through the session I put you in, and if you come back after that, I'll keep showing you more and more. And so for some guys, they persevered and went through the painful sessions my dad put them through. A lot of them never came back, but few of them ever were angry or upset with my dad. They just kind of realized, wrestling isn't for me. And so that was sort of my dad's playground. He would go down and work out with guys once or twice a week, and it kind of gave him release, kind of escape from the stresses of the wrestling industry and dealing with 12 kids. And my dad, he was just phenomenal. He did everything. He would make all the dinners. He would drive us to and from school. In a lot of cases, we couldn't get bus access, maybe because of the snowstorms and the icy roads. My dad always would drive us to school in the morning, pick us up for lunch, take us home for an hour, make us lunch, drive us back to school. It was just incredible everything he did, in addition to running the day-to-day operations of the wrestling business, and my mom was working in the office all day. My dad, he was everything. He was a chef. He knew how to sew. He knew how to weld. He was just very multi-talented, and first and foremost, he was just a great athlete. But he did everything. He raised 12 kids. He was so busy, and that was sort of his lifestyle. There was never any vacations or breaks for him. But when he occasionally got the chance to work out in the gym and teach guys and keep his craft, as a wrestler, it was great for him. It was just a nice release, that he didn't very often get.
And how did some of the other Canadian wrestling promotions get along with Stampede Wrestling? Was there a level of competition, or do they all get along? Or
I think we all got along. I think everyone kind of ran their own territories. My dad had pretty good relationships with all of them. Sandor Kovacs, who was a close friend of my dad's when he was breaking in the late 40s, in New York, working for Toots Mondt, and Sandor was wrestling there with my dad, with Jan Bleers and I think Joe Blanchard and Paul Bosch. So Sandor eventually set up his own promotion on the West Coast in Vancouver, and eventually went into a partnership with Gene Kiniski. So they had the West Coast, which included all British Columbia and parts of Washington. And my dad had Alberta and Saskatchewan and parts of Montana. And Vern Gagne only ran Winnipeg with the AWA. He would run there like every 3 weeks. So he ran his big shows there. And then Frank Tunney had shows in Toronto and pretty much all of Ontario. And then I think it was Jack Britton with Gino Brito that was running Montreal and Quebec, and Emile Dupre in the Maritimes. So it was great because my dad would exchange talent with a lot of them. Sometimes if we had one wrestler that was maybe with us for too long and they needed to go elsewhere, it was hard to get visas to go to the States for a lot of wrestlers then. So then my dad would exchange wrestlers maybe with Kovacs in Vancouver, or maybe Frank Tunney would send somebody to get some polish or break in with my dad, for several months. And it was great because there was steady work everywhere in Canada, but it was a nice partnership, and it was never a rivalry. There was everyone kind of ran their own promotions. Nobody broke that barrier, to run opposition to other promoters, and everyone kind of respected their territories, their physical boundaries, and would exchange talent with the other promoters, and it was great. It was a really good network for Canada.
That's great to hear. Any interactions with Jack Tunney over the years?
Not personally. I know he was sort of a figurehead president of the WWF after Frank's passing, and so I think he kind of took over the promotion after his dad's death. Kind of similar to what happened with Vince Jr. and Vince McMahon in New York, but at that time that Jack took over, that's when Vince started his expansion, and part of that was establishing Maple Leaf Wrestling, which is kind of the Canadian sector of the WWF, and they had the TV tapings in I think in Poughkeepsie, Ontario, and Brampton, like every 2 weeks. So that was a pretty important part of the WWF's getting established in Canada, because that was kind of the hub race basically for WWF, and then the TV tapings there, and then they they still continue to run shows in the Maple Leaf Gardens, I think every 3 weeks or so, and Jack, I think, was part of the financial end of that, and then he became sort of the figurehead president of the WWF, I think, before Gorilla Monsoon maybe took that role. So and I think he's passed since then, but I think he was a very key figure for Vince getting launched and established after Frank's passing in 1984.
And for the fans that aren't familiar, if you can give us some memories and maybe some of the history of your late brother Smith Hart.
Smith, he doesn't get as much recognition or I guess credit as my other brothers. He was really the first one that actually broke into wrestling, I think around 72, 73. But he loved wrestling. He was often talking to my dad about what ways to kind of enhance the promotion, and maybe having more of an interactive network with other promotions. Maybe it was Florida or Texas or LA and Puerto Rico at one stage. Smith's first wife came from Puerto Rico, and he was actually wrestling there with Brett. And my dad was kind of sending and taking some talent from there, but he kind of fell out of favor with my dad. He maybe didn't have the work ethic or drive, that Bruce and Keith and later Brett and Owen did. He sometimes, being the oldest son, you have the most responsibility and the highest expectations to succeed. And my dad always hoped that for Smith, and on several levels that didn't happen, and sometimes bad breaks, and sometimes Smith just made some poor choices and fell out of my dad's favor, and my dad finally, as the last resort, sent him to Japan, for the IWE wrestling office. Tokyo Joe was booking there after he tragically lost his leg in a car accident, had to have his leg amputated in 1974. That happened on the way to Lethbridge, a spot show during a terrible snowstorm in 1974. But anyway, my dad was, had kind of had his limit with Smith, and Smith just seemed to be getting into one problem after another, sometimes with the police or authority figures, and so my dad sent him to Japan, to go through their training, be one of their gaijin, one of their students, but he would train alongside the Japanese. And I think he had hoped that Smith would develop kind of a work ethic and could actually learn how to wrestle. But it was a hard experience for Smith when he went over there. I think they were exceptionally hard on him, maybe because he was Canadian, maybe because they knew he was sort of sent there as a as a disciplinary measure, to reform and so they didn't make things easy for him, and it was very hard for Smith. He was just treated sort of like one of the younger gaijin boys there, and didn't have the freedom or space that he had in Calgary, and he didn't respond well after he was there for about 3 months, and kind of came home in disgrace, and my dad was, was so let down, so disappointed that Smith had kind of failed again, and yet, he loved the industry, he could really pinpoint good talent and work ethic with a lot of wrestlers, but never made the, never had the success, I guess, or the exposure that Bruce or Keith had, just because he kind of fell out of favor with my dad and, made some poor lifestyle choices. But and then, sadly, he passed away from prostate cancer, many years later. And, a lot of that, I think, was because he wasn't taking care of himself. Smith always had so many different things going on. He was trying to buy property. He was trying to invest money, and a lot of those things sometimes didn't work out. Sometimes they were spontaneous, impulsive things, and then sometimes he ran out of money, or somebody kind of maybe took advantage of him or misled him, and it kind of ended up where all the money he had from my parents' estate, he'd blown all of that, in a couple of years. He bought a house in Edmonton, and then, instead of maintaining and looking after that house, and really he had enough to kind of live on for the rest of his life with his inheritance. But Smith was trying to buy property in Vancouver Island, and he was trying to buy property in Puerto Rico, and he became so scattered, that he didn't look after his priorities, and then his house kind of fell into the wrong hands, and some squatters and people that he had kind of looking after it initially, destroyed the house, just because he wasn't there overseeing it or watching it, and then he fell behind on his mortgage payments, and, and it was unfortunate for Smith. It was just sort of a lot of bad breaks, but sometimes, just not prioritizing the most important things, like looking after his kids or managing his money, so he could, live comfortably for the rest of his life. And, that seemed to be his MO. And yet, he's very passionate about the wrestling industry. And, we had good relations with Smith, even though, probably wasn't the best role model that we looked up to. I probably learned some of my better behaviors more from Bruce and Keith, than Smith. And yet I think he had some good points though too, and again, he loved the industry, and probably if he was a little more settled, could have worked well in a promoter's or office role, and yet sometimes he wanted to exceed that and have more control as a booker, or a trainer. And sometimes you have to focus on one role and make the most of that. And there's no denying Smith's passion and sometimes his work ethic, but sometimes it was a little misguided too.
Yeah. So let's go back to WrestleMania 10, Madison Square Garden. It's 1994. Your brothers, Brett and Owen, open up the show, their first one-on-one ever on pay-per-view. And, as far as an opener goes. And, kind of take us back to that weekend. Any memories you have of that weekend of Brett versus Owen and MSG? And, it was a special night.
Yeah, it was really special. And we were watching it on pay-per-view at home, but I was very excited, especially for Owen. Owen had risen in the WWF, with this storyline they had created for him to work against Brett. So it was the jealous younger brother, um, and always kind of being in the shadows. And it was a great storyline, and it was exciting to see him wrestle Brett. And I knew they would have exceptional matches. They were both such great technicians, and there was no egos involved there. And I think Brett really wanted Owen to succeed. Brett had already become established. He had been world champion, intercontinental champion, and it was a new role for Owen because they hadn't used him to the best of their abilities. He'd been kind of held back as the Blue Blazer, and then in different tag teams. I think he had been in a tag team with Jim Neidhart, and that crumbled when they fired Jim, and then they put him with Coco Beware, and that had kind of a limited shelf life, and they weren't doing a lot with Owen in singles, and he was just kind of he really was the younger brother in Brett's shadows, and then they came up with this idea, and I think it was maybe Pat Patterson or Brett, like we'll turn Owen heel against Brett, as the younger brother who's feeling overlooked, and Brett's always had the breaks, and it got over great, and it was like a whole new role for Owen, and he got over great as a heel, but he was still a good technical wrestler, but he was obviously more sneaky, more devious, and it was exciting to watch that match, and then Owen beats Brett, with I think he reversed a pin on him, I think a victory roll or something, and people began to take him seriously. They realized, Owen just beat his older brother, and it was kind of an upset. And yet Brett came on later in the show and won the title against Yokozuna, right, on that same show, and became world champion. So it was great, and they had a long program. They worked those marathon matches for many months, and then Owen was instrumental in Brett losing the title to Bob Backlund at Survivor Series in an angle which even used my parents, in the audience, and it was great to finally see Owen, get that exposure and that push, and he and Brett were very unselfish. They went out and had great matches, and they really looked out for each other when they were on the road. They were their best friends, and each one watched over the other. And that was great. Because they sometimes on the road, there's a lot of other guys that aren't looking out for you or maybe influencing you in the wrong ways. And Brett and Owen, they both looked out for each other. And they had such a strong bond, such a great relationship, and it was great, so it was exciting to see that match, and just how well they complement each other in the ring. They had phenomenal matches, and it was definitely a turning point for Owen in his career.
And after WrestleMania 10, we would see, Brett and Bulldog team with Anvil and Owen a couple times, Monday Night Raw and the Action Zone. We'd see Brett versus Owen in a no-holds-barred match on Monday Night Raw. And eventually we would see a match which is my personal favorite of Brett and Owen. And I feel like it doesn't get as much credit as the WrestleMania 10 match. And that would be SummerSlam 94, the steel cage at the Chicago United Center. I thought it was just a fantastic match. And then it was great to get the whole family involved. You were involved in that. Everybody trying to climb up the cage, and the anticipation was just building, and it was very well done, I thought. Any memories of that particular night?
Yeah, I was there at that match, and it was great because they had Brett and Owen going at it, and it was quite conceivable that Owen might win the match and beat Brett for the title, so and it was a great match back and forth, but the elements of the family at ringside and kind of divided. I think most of us were cheering for Brett because he was the baby face, but then Jim Neidhart kind of turned at the end, and I think clotheslined Davy Boy and my sister Diana, took a back bump, over the guard railings, and then everybody was trying to get in the ring at the finish. It was just kind of chaos, and it was great. It looked so believable. Um, it was nice extension, basically, of Owen's feud with Brett, because then it was um, kind of Owen and Jim going against Brett and Davey, and then eventually I think Davey turned heel on Brett too. And then a while later they kind of reformed the Hart Foundation, and then they became a heel element in the States too. But it was great seeing those family dynamics, and not to even mention Brett's classic match at Wembley with Davey Boy, which had such a great storyline with Diana being Brett's sister and wife of Davey, and Davey pinning Brett, in Wembley, and then they, after such a hard fought classic struggle, it went over 30 minutes, and then they, had that embrace and handshake, at the end of the match. It was incredible. There's just so many storylines there, and then again, with the reforming of the Hart Foundation and Brett uniting with not only Owen and Davey, but they brought Jim Neidhart back, and then they brought Pillman in, who had a connection with my brother Bruce with Stampede Wrestling, and they were even talking about bringing Bruce in, as another star, and he was going to maybe work with Jerry Lawler's son Brian Christopher for the junior heavyweight title. Unfortunately, that didn't come about, but there was just so many possibilities there, and business was great. I think that angle with the Canada versus U.S. feud was incredible, and it was, and it probably could have gone on for another year or two, except for the Survivor Series and how that ended up, and Brett having to leave WWE, and Davey close behind him, and Owen having to stay with WWE on his own, and it was really unfortunate, how it ended up, but at the time it was great, that Canadian Stampede pay-per-view in '97 was just incredible, and fans in Canada, standing close behind Brett and the Hart Foundation, and yet, arch villains in the U.S. And when Stone Cold Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels and the Legion of Doom came to Canada, they were booed, and that. And in these times now, with the strained relations, economically, and with the trade tariffs between Canada and the U.S. and the rants of Donald Trump, people can really relate to that geographical rivalry that they had, between the Team Canada and Team U.S. And it was just phenomenal. It was it really was great TV ratings, and so it was such a good storyline for WWE that we're in a fight for survival with WCW Nitro, right? And the ratings wars with Raw and Nitro on Mondays, right? But that was just such a great storyline, and just incredible matches, right? And angles that they had then.
Yeah. And you mentioned in your house, Canadian Stampede, as a fan watching that, I thoroughly enjoyed the 10-man tag. It was a great match and a great showing. And obviously the audience, so behind the Hearts, of course. But at the end, I think that was the best part, is having the whole family in the ring, to celebrate. Any memory of that moment in particular?
Yeah, it was exciting. I don't even think I can't remember. I don't know if it had been planned before the match that all of the family members would come in. I think it was just kind of a spontaneous reaction, when I think Owen pinned Steve Austin to win, and the crowd was just going crazy, because the Canadians had won. And then one by one, all the brothers and sisters of the family came in, and then the nieces and nephews, all the grandchildren of Stu and Helen came in the ring, and it was just amazing, like what a celebration that was. Brett's kids were in the ring. I remember Oj coming in, to be with his father, and he's seeing so many generations of all the family members coming in the ring, and the whole ring was just filled with all these hearts. and it was such a special moment, and the live audience, just loved it. It was, especially in the theme of beating the Americans, right? Winning that round, and it was great because it also set up SummerSlam matchups, with Brett against Shawn Michaels, Owen against Steve Austin. I think Davey was working with Ken Shamrock, right? And these were all individual storylines that came out of that 10-man tag, and it was just phenomenal business, and just a lot of great memories.
And one other match that I should touch on is the 1993 Survivor Series, the Boston Garden. Of course, it was originally supposed to be Jerry Lawler and his Knights against the Hart family. Jerry was out for a while, so it would be Shawn Michaels and his Knights. And I thought that was such a special match because, you didn't get to see Bruce or Keith on WWF television in a wrestling capacity. So it was a special night to have all the Harts, together like that. Any memories from that evening?
Yeah, and I was at the show live. I think it was one of the last events they had at the Boston Garden too.
Yeah.
But it was great seeing Bruce and Keith tagging with Brett and Owen, and so a lot of the WWF fans didn't have a lot of knowledge about Bruce and Keith's careers because they had been big in the the late 70s and the 80s, and had kind of had their time and moved on. They were still involved with wrestling, I think, a little bit. They're training guys, but really were semi-retired. But it was great. They were part of the storyline, to tag team with Brett and Owen. It would have been great if it was Jerry Lawler, who was in the match because he had a big rivalry with Brett and Owen, and Jerry had insulted my mom and dad at shows, and it was a great angle. And then when they had to pull him out of the match because of his legal problems in Tennessee, they had to kind of interject Shawn Michaels and then three other masked men, and that was a bit of a disappointment, but it was still a novelty to see Brett and Bruce and Owen and Keith all tag teaming, and I thought Bruce and Keith looked great, for guys that were, I guess late 40s, early 50s, and they looked great. They held their own in the match, and it wasn't like a bunch of old timers going in the ring and just kind of going through the motions. I thought Bruce and Keith performed great, and it started the storyline of Owen turning against his whole family because at the end of the match, he was kind of distant with Brett because I think Owen was the only one that dropped a fall, and there was some kind of a miscue with him and Brett, but the Harts won the match ultimately, which was great. But it planted that seed, of Owen going against Bruce and Keith, and then Brett, more extensively, and then that further escalated, I think, when they lost a tag match to the Mounties or something, and then Owen, just completely did an about face and turned against Brett. But it was a real special moment to see all of them in that tag match, and for us to be there and celebrate it there live, it was very, very special.
And your parents would often obviously be, in the front row for shows for many years. Did they enjoy being there at the shows, or any feedback that they ever give, It
was interesting. My mom never liked being a public figure. She never ever went to the wrestling shows. She always was very reserved and behind the scenes. She's very refined. She really didn't want to be at the shows. You would never see her on a Friday night at the matches. And yet she had so many interactions with fans over the phone or wrestlers or promoters. She was in the office front and center, but she really didn't want to be at the shows, or in the spotlight. My dad, being the promoter and sometimes the enforcer with wrestlers, he was a presence at all the shows, and my mom didn't really want that kind of attention. She was very refined and, as I said earlier, like spending her moments with her daughters, when the wrestlers were when all the sons would go to the wrestling shows to my dad. My mom, enjoyed just reading and spending time with her daughters. But after they had kind of closed and gotten out of wrestling, WWE approached Brett about, my mom and dad making some appearances at shows, and then actually being involved with angles, like with the Bob Backlund match where Owen,
The towel.
foiled my mom, and convinced her to throw in the towel, and my dad didn't want to do it, and then the exchanges with Jerry Lawler at shows, and I think my mom kind of enjoyed it. She knew that it was just a storyline. She didn't have to take it too seriously, and it was something that was helping Brett and Owen, and it was quite plausible, and I don't think anybody ever thought it as exploitation or wanting to be in the spotlight, and WWF, to their credit, they were very classy in how they made arrangements. They'd put my parents up in hotels and get them limousine service to and from the shows. And it was great. My parents got that kind of treatment, and it was really kind of a working holiday. And then they got paid. They got paid very well, and so they should have, because they were part of an interesting storyline and angle. So it was interesting that my mom, kind of gave up her initial reluctance to really be in the spotlight or be the focus. And years later, when she was kind of out of wrestling and not having to worry about it on a day-to-day basis, or losing money from it, or all the stresses that she and my dad had to go through, it was fun just to actually go to these shows and not have to worry about anything, and just follow a storyline which was so natural for them. And it was something that was enhancing the TV show, and actually helped Brett and Owen, and it was a lot of fun for them.
Now, do you or any other family members have any keepsakes from your mom or your dad, as far as from the wrestling business or their time in Stampede or whatever it may be?
A lot of some of the possessions and archives just kind of got divided, when my parents had passed away, and the house got sold, and it was kind of sad. A lot of things just kind of got taken, and everyone was just sort of grabbing pictures or memorabilia, for themselves, because they didn't want other people or other family members maybe to get it. So, and it was kind of unfortunate, some of it did go to the Calgary Museum, the Glenbow Museum, and they had a Mavericks exhibit on my dad, and they displayed some of the championship belts that were part of the promotion, and various artifacts. But I don't have anything specific other than some great pictures. My sister Allison has kind of archived all the photos of family members, all the Christmas card pictures we took, and what she was able to get, and some of the wrestlers, and she's done just a tremendous job of saving all of those, and then providing other family members access to that. But when the house got sold, unfortunately, that was where we grew up, and that was gone, and the dungeon was gone, and a place where we had a lot of our wonderful childhood memories. But the reality was, that there were no specific family members that could look after the house, and it needed a lot of restoration and repairs. And I don't think any particular family member, even Brett, maybe had the most money, really wanted to undertake that. And we were kind of a divided family, unfortunately, after the WWF lawsuit over Owen's tragic death, and the house got sold, and it was kind of an end of an era. But now we have very good relations with each other. We celebrate a lot of anniversaries and reunions, which is great, and have dinners together. And it took time to heal from a lot of those things, like Owen's death, unfortunately, and my mom's and my dad's passing, and the house that got sold. And thankfully the house is still there in Calgary, and it's a protected historical landmark that will always remain. The owners aren't allowed to destroy the house or rebuild the house itself, and that means a lot to me, and a lot of the family members, and it's because it was such an important location in the city, and a landmark, not only for us as a family, but the whole city, because, that's where we lived, and that's where Stampede Wrestling was based, and that's where the Dungeon was based, and and it was one of the oldest landmarks of the city. Built in 1915. The history of the house was just incredible, and that's a story itself. Where we all grew up and had so many wonderful childhood memories. But and I'm thankful that it's still there.
And what would you say, in your personal opinion, is the legacy of your father, Stu?
Really hard to sum up in a few sentences, but a hardworking person, who grew up during the Great Depression and overcame a lot of hardships and poverty. And what saved him, I think, was his involvement in sports. Going into amateur wrestling and qualifying for the Olympic team, and being able to raise 12 kids. I had a wonderful marriage with my mom, and raising 12 kids, and establishing one of the best wrestling promotions in the world. And I think my dad just had a great work ethic. He was a hard worker and very giving, and gave so much to the fans he put wrestling on for, the guys that he broke in. And my dad, when he broke in guys and trained them, he never took any money from them. He was just happy to give some of them the opportunity, to go far in wrestling, if they followed his mentorship and his training. And and some of those that did, like George Gordienko and Luther Lindsay, went on to become such successes, in the industry, and he raised 12 kids, which was not easy. There were a lot of ups and downs in the wrestling industry. Sometimes he made a lot of money. Sometimes there were difficult times, and unfortunately some tragedies, unfortunate things that happened toward the end. But my dad, though, and my mom, just had a tremendous work ethic, and were very committed to raising their family, and really teaching us important values, like respect, and hard work, and really focusing on the importance of your dreams, and looking after your money, and really extending kindness and respect toward others, if you wanted that in return. And those were really the important values that my parents both instilled in all of their kids.
And if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of background and insight on your late brother, Dean.
Dean, yeah. Dean was 6 years older than me. He wasn't involved in the wrestling industry as much as some of his brothers, although he was a good referee. He did referee a lot, and then he was a really good mechanic, and get good at setting up rings. But Dean sort of had a little of my dad's mechanical influence on him. He knew a little bit about welding. He was really good with fixing cars, and a good repairman. Dean was just really sharp in that sense, but probably too small to actually get into wrestling. He was a very good amateur wrestler, actually, in school. Always did well in his weight class, and just tenacious. Dean wouldn't back down from anybody. He was a fighter all the way. Sometimes, you'd get into occasional fights with some of his older brothers, but Dean, was very gutsy. He was very loyal, to everyone in the family, and I think he contributed in a lot of different ways. Not so much in the ring, but doing a lot of the things that maybe people didn't get much credit or recognition for. Like setting up the rings, driving the ring trucks, or setting up cages for matches, and that kind of was how Dean contributed. But he was quite an entrepreneur himself. He promoted some rock concerts and some at my dad's Clearwater Beach location, and brought in a few interesting names. A few big name acts in the 1970s, and for a guy that didn't have a lot of financial backing or working with other people, he was kind of doing it on his own. He did quite well. He took some risks. Some things he lost money on. Other things he did quite well on. I remember he promoted a Charlie Rich country concert at McMahon Stadium, where there's 35,000 seats, and brought him in as a big act in Calgary, during the Stampede. And fortunately, didn't draw very well. I think there was some difficulties in setting up the show, and maybe Dean wasn't working with the right Ticketmaster type operation, to promote it. But it showed a lot of integrity and courage on his part to do something like that. Even though he ultimately lost money on it, and some things he was quite successful in. But Dean was a risk taker, and he was never afraid to take some challenges and risks. And I always admired that about him. It was just unfortunate how he passed away, with some kind of kidney ailment, which I think was maybe caused from getting hit by a transit bus. Ironically, when he actually stepped out on a curb to prevent I think it was a female, to get hit by a bus, and he himself got hit from behind, and he was hospitalized and recovered, miraculously from that. But then years later, had kidney disease, and we think that may have been caused from getting hit by that bus. And then the last few years were really difficult for Dean. He had to go on dialysis, and it was pretty tough. What he went through and what Smith went through with the prostate cancer. So, and we love them very much and miss them a lot. And the rest of us are pretty thankful. We've endured and survived ourselves. Brett's experienced prostate cancer, and with an early diagnosis, there was a different outcome for him and Smith. They both had the same physician, ironically, and because it was diagnosed with Brett early, he was able to beat it. Same with my brother Keith, and unfortunately Smith, with his lifestyle and maybe wasn't staying in one place and was maybe not living the most stable lifestyle, and he got diagnosed much later with prostate cancer, and it was kind of too late. It already had taken over his body. So it was tough what what Smith and Dean went through. And yet and Owen's tragedy was such a unfortunate thing and such a needless and senseless thing. So, but I'm very grateful to have great family relations with all my surviving siblings, and celebrate so many great memories with them, and and enjoy important traditions like Christmas and Thanksgiving and birthdays and things like that.
And we share a great friend in Mr. Tom Burke, the wrestling historian himself. How did that friendship start for you?
Interesting. Tom, true historian. I think I was a kid in school, and I used to read wrestling magazines all the time. And I had noticed a few of Tom's articles in the Ring Wrestling magazine. And then I started corresponding with Tom a little bit. I was only maybe about 15 or 16 years old. And then he wrote a really nice article on my dad in Stampede Wrestling. I think it was in the 1976 edition of Ring Wrestling. And I provided some pictures for it and some background about my dad's career and promotion, and Tom wrote just a great article on that. And then we kept in touch after that. And then Tom started his Global Wrestling newsletter, which came out once a month. And he would always I would send him results and updates on the Stampede territory, and Tom would always include that. So And we just kept in touch over the years. And, we've gone to Cauliflower Alley and Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame events together. And Tom has, an incredible collection of memorabilia, as you know, and it's great. We keep in touch, and there's very few historians like Tom that are still left, that, have a pretty accurate recall of, the pioneer periods of the 50s and 60s and that classic wrestling era, and he's one of the few left, that still has a lot of memories and recollections of those periods. And it's great having conversations with Tom, and a very dear friend of mine.
And somebody who's not really often brought up, and I'd love to hear about his history, is your brother Wayne.
Yeah, Wayne was another one who wasn't so much on the wrestling side of things, but he was a great referee. He really took refereeing seriously, and it was an important job for Wayne. Everything he did with wrestling, because he was the driver of the vans that transported a lot of the wrestlers, and nobody could overcome the obstacles that we faced, with the frigid weather conditions, ice, rain, the blackout sometimes, and Wayne was just an incredible professional driver. Everyone felt safe with him behind the wheel. He set up rings. He sometimes drove the ring trucks. Sometimes a lot of them were badly in need of repairs, and probably shouldn't have been on the road, but Wayne would get those vehicles to and from the shows, the best he could. But everything he did, he took very seriously, and with his refereeing, it was his job to make it look like a real contest, and communicate with the wrestlers, and not just sort of be a figurehead or a third person in the ring, that the guys get heat on or something. Wayne really coveted his role, of being the person who called the match and declared the winner at the end, and he took his role very seriously. And that's what kind of made Wayne unique. He wasn't a wrestler per se, although he had a couple of matches, but he communicated well with the wrestlers, and yet he was very consistent. If he was reffing a match and somebody had their shoulders down longer than 3 seconds, Wayne would count you out, even though that wasn't the intended finish. Because in his eyes, if he didn't count, that just was an expose. In the fans' eyes, the referee deliberately didn't count or botched a finish because that wasn't, the planned outcome. So Wayne was very consistent in that sense, and even though it kind of got him criticism from some of the wrestlers, he was really doing the right thing. If somebody had their shoulders down, or if they're outside the ring for more than 10 seconds and Wayne was counting, Wayne would, follow his role as an officiator and, as an official, and do the right thing in the promotions of the fans' eyes, and and count them out or count their shoulders down, because that's what had to be done. So Wayne certainly contributed a lot, in different ways. I did a lot behind the scenes with media relations and press releases and writing the body press program. I learned so many things working for my mom, who was very well educated and such a good speaker and writer. I contributed in more of those ways. Wayne and Dean were more behind the scenes, setting up rings, driving the vehicles to and from shows, and then Wayne refereeing as well.
So holidays at the Hart House, what was that like, having everybody together like that?
It was great. We always had Christmas dinners together. The promotion was, dominating our lives in so many ways. Sometimes we had wrestling shows 6-7 nights a week, but we would always have a Christmas dinner, or an Easter dinner or Thanksgiving dinner. And my parents would have the entire family over, and then other guests and extended family, sometimes wrestlers. And it was great. My dad was a really good chef, so sometimes he would carve a turkey or a ham, and uh, um, it was great. My mom would be in the kitchen. Maybe she would look after the potatoes or vegetables, and my dad would focus on the roast or the main dish. And Georgia, my older sister, she really learned how to cook. Working with my dad, she became just an incredible chef herself. But it was wonderful. We had those celebrations, birthday celebrations. My parents would always remember our birthdays, and my sister Georgia would bake a cake, and we would have family members over, and it was great. And even after the wrestling kind of closed down, we still had Sunday dinners regularly at my parents' house, and and it was very nice. It was just my parents' way of keeping the family together and alive and sharing good food, and we could put stresses away from the family or finances aside, and just enjoy a really nice meal together. And we kept those traditions. We had regular family dinners every Sunday, right up to when my parents passed, which was great. And we had this big dining room with this long dinner table, which could seat about 30 people, and it was wonderful. Just having those dinners. Even after we had grown up and moved out of the house, and we're busy with our own lives, raising kids or having different jobs. We would look forward to those Sunday dinners at my parents' place, and and Georgia would help my parents with the cooking and preparing everything, and then we would all kind of contribute at the end and clean things up. But it was great how our family stayed very close and united, all those years.
Yeah. And just looking back at your in-ring career, if you had to choose three, what would your top three favorite matches be that you were a part of, or opponents?
I it would probably be on the Stampede circuit. I certainly didn't have a celebrated career like Brad or Owen, but I was happy to get in the ring occasionally, and if I worked with somebody experienced, it was great, and for me, it was never about getting my hand raised or being the next Hart who was going to be a superstar. Sometimes I just worked to fill in gaps, or worked on spot shows. I seldom worked in. I don't think I ever worked in Calgary or Edmonton, because my role there was to direct the TV show, or get the wrestlers into their matches, right? But personally, I think my three favorite matches might be working with the Cuban Commandos, Jerry Morrow and the Cuban Assassin, because I had some tag matches with them. We'd go on the road and work on spot shows, and it was great because I didn't have any pressure. I didn't have to live up to expectations to be as good as Brad or Owen, and I certainly wasn't, but I would say I was a credible enough wrestler, a decent enough wrestler. So I enjoyed having matches with them because they were such professionals. They called a really good match, and I could learn so much from them. And you could never have a bad match with them. I think Owen and I had some really enjoyable tag team matches when we were in the UK. I think we worked a couple of tag matches with Fit Finlay and a guy named Skull Murphy, which were kind of enjoyable. It was the only time that I ever actually tag teamed with Owen, even though we were really raw rookies at that time. But it was a great memory, having a televised match there. And it was not in the Stampede promotion, but, it was overseas. And, we were billed as the I think the Calgary Cowboys or something like that, and we wore cowboy hats and vests in the ring, and it was pretty unique, pretty special, that I got to tag team with Owen. And then I guess my very first match, which was pretty memorable, was in Budapest, Hungary, of all places. I'd never ever wrestled even on a Stampede show. It was a few months before Owen and I wrestled in the UK together, but I happened to go there, and somebody else couldn't wrestle in Hungary because the immigration officials didn't let some wrestlers in. This was, it was a communist country at that time, and borders were really strict, and some wrestlers could not get into Hungary. So they said, "You need to wrestle. We need you to fill a spot on the show." So I was able to get into the country with my Canadian passport. And I can't remember who I wrestled, but I tag teamed with the guy who was promoting, some guy named Arpad Weber, and I was sort of the younger baby face, but and I kind of had to do the selling and give him a big hot comeback tag in the end, and that was my role in the match. But it was exciting. It was over 10,000 fans in an open air stadium, and and I think I used some name. I didn't even go as one of the Harts or Ross Hart. I think I used the name of somebody else who didn't show up, who couldn't make the show, someone named Gerard Merce or something like that. And it was fun, because and the live audience was just going crazy, right? They'd never, as far as I knew, seen professional wrestling before, probably not even on TV, and the fans were just going crazy. It was just the live reaction to it, So I'd say those were kind of my three most memorable matches as a performer myself.
And, we talked about your father's legacy. Maybe we could just shed a little bit more light on your mother, Helen. Obviously, you said she was a very dedicated worker, worked behind the scenes, took the phone calls. Maybe give us some more info on her role, and also, what she was like as a mother.
Yeah, my mom, just an incredible person. She could have done so many things. She graduated from high school, I think, when she was about 15 or 16, and then worked sort of as a paralegal secretary, I think, for a school board. She could have been a school teacher. She could have been an accountant. Like, she just had so many different skills. Her typing skills, she could, probably type 120 words a minute, really accurate. Knew shorthand writing, was such a proper person, and she had so many different skills, and kind of ran my dad's payroll and did all his bookkeeping, and answered all the phone calls, and yet was a great mother figure to all of us. She, even though she and my dad dealt with a lot of stress and difficulty, sometimes losing money at different stages, she was always such a gracious mother, and instilled in us important values, about respect and self-respect, and listening to your elders, and being appropriate in schools, and being kind and sharing with other people, and that's what I remember about my mom. She was just she had so many roles working for my dad, and yet was a gracious and giving mother figure to all of us, and was that way, all her life, and with her kids and her grandchildren, and I wish she and my dad could have had more opportunities to enjoy their lives together, because so much of it was consumed with the wrestling industry. And even after they retired, they were always kind of having to look after the house itself, and sometimes put out fires with their kids and their grandchildren. And I wish they'd had more opportunities to travel and see different areas of the world, but it was sort of the role, they'd become accustomed to, always living in the house, and kind of dealing with whatever came their way, whether it was good or bad, whether it was a hardship, or something they enjoyed. But and having over 50 years of a marriage together, was just incredible considering all the ups and downs that they went through. But, all of us were so much better, because of the positive impact both my parents had on us.
And we talked about Wayne, we talked about Smith, and obviously Dean. If you could shed just a little bit more light on Keith and Bruce. Obviously, Keith was a wrestler. He was a firefighter. Maybe just give us some of the background on them.
Yeah, they were kind of the wrestling success figures, before Brett broke in and Owen years later. And, they were wrestling in the early 70s, which was incredible. And, my dad kind of gave them that opportunity, but my dad never really pushed them too much because they were smaller. And my dad didn't want anybody thinking, well, the promoters' kids are going to get used well and pushed well. And, that maybe wasn't the case in other promotions or territories where promoters' sons were pushed to the top. And sometimes that created a lot of barriers with other wrestlers, and sometimes on the kids themselves because it put too much pressure on them to, perform to their father's expectations. So, but Bruce and Keith, they kind of established the Hart name, second generation after my dad, and worked in preliminaries for quite a few years, but really learned how to work, and were multifaceted. Keith was booking for my dad at a very early age, not because he wanted to, but because really my dad needed a right-hand man that was sort of close to the family and could look after the matches and keep the wrestlers under control and get them to all the shows. And, Keith was kind of an unsung hero in that sense. And Bruce kind of took on that role years later, as a booker, wrestler, and a trainer, who ran his own training camp. And Bruce and Keith ran the Hart Brothers Pro Wrestling Camp very successfully. When you look at some of the guys they had an influence on, everyone from Chris Benoit to Kichi Yamada to Hiroshi Hase to Brian Pillman. They became really good teachers, right? And they helped break in a lot of guys. And so I think with Keith and Bruce, they're very well rounded. They knew their way around the ring. They were great teachers. They were great role models to their younger family members. And I think they made a lot of sacrifices. They sometimes didn't make a lot of money like the other wrestlers. And my dad certainly didn't show them a lot of leniency or favoritism. He made them earn whatever they got. And yet I think it gave them a lot of notoriety. And Keith kind of branched off and became a firefighter, but still stayed involved with wrestling. Bruce was often, and they both became, very successful substitute school teachers, because the wrestling schedules kind of allowed them to work as teachers in the daytime. Keith was often firefighting, wrestling, and teaching, and Bruce was often running his training camp, sub-teaching, and then wrestling, and booking shows, so very, very busy, very active, but I think they helped pave the way for Brett and Owen, who became successful, and they were sort of I think stepping down a little bit, as the older brothers, and paved the way for Owen and Brett, I should say Brett and Owen. Brett broke in before Owen, to become the next generation of Harts, to become really successful. Although for a time, Brett and Bruce and Keith were all wrestling at one time together, and it was great seeing some of their 6-man tag matches, and it was a big drawing card when the Hart family would wrestle, and occasionally Stu would come out of retirement, step in the ring, and team with some of his sons, which was pretty interesting. And then years later, when Owen broke in the 80s, he was very closely paired with Bruce, who was still wrestling, and Brian Pillman at the time, and there was a lot of great matches there, and it was nice. I think it was just so many different roles that they had, and they all contributed to the industry and kind of paving the way for the younger generation of family members and wrestlers to break in. So, I think Bruce and Keith deserve a lot of credit, for what they accomplished in their own right. Even though they don't get as much recognition or attention as Brett and Owen, who really had the opportunity to wrestle for WWF and Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith and Jim Neidhart, some of them. They got those opportunities, I guess, that Bruce and Keith didn't, more in the territory days. And yet, I think they all individually contributed in so many different ways.
And what is your take on AEW being very forthcoming in keeping the memory of Owen alive and, getting him involved in different things, having the Owen Hart tournament and that sort of thing?
I think it's really nice. I think it's a fitting testament, to Owen's career and his legacy. Unfortunately, WWE won't be able to do anything like that with my sister-in-law, Martha. She's had pretty negative relations with them, and rightfully so. I think WWE would like to maybe honor Owen more and celebrate his life, but she will not partake in anything like that. She doesn't want any dealings with them, and any references to Owen. I think they put out a few videos on Owen that kind of celebrated his career, but she was willing to do it with AEW because they obviously weren't responsible for Owen's death, and she didn't have a lawsuit against them, and she's had a really, I guess, close relationship with Tony Khan and some of the AEW staff. So I think it's great they have the Owen Hart tournament once a year, and she's there to crown the winner, I guess, and I think that's sort of the extent of her involvement with wrestling. So I certainly support that. I wish they were doing better. I'm not entirely happy with AEW's development of talent and their storylines, and I wish they could compete more with WWE. But that's really a side issue, I guess. But I think how they've honored Owen, though, with the tournament once a year in his name, I think is great. And it's not exploitative at all. It's really just celebrating the impact that he had in his career on so many fans and wrestlers.
Yeah, it's great to see a new Owen Hart action figure and, different things like that. And just keeping him alive for new generations that are coming in and, of children. And it's a good thing. So,
absolutely true.
When it comes to Mount Rushmore, as we're winding down here to the very end, Mount Rushmore of pro wrestling, you could obviously look at it in different ways, personal favorites or whoever had the biggest impact in the industry. But looking at it any way you'd like to, who would your personal Mount Rushmore, any era of pro wrestling be?
It'd really be hard to pinpoint one wrestler, because there's just so many who did so much for the industry, and I'd be sounding biased, if I picked Brett or Owen, even though I think they've done so much for the industry in so many ways, but on a lot of levels, you look at guys that were really pioneers of the industry who added so much credibility in their matches and were box office draws and just made other wrestlers look great. And I think of guys like Dory Funk, Harley Race, the incredible longevity they had, and how much stability they provided the NWA World Championship. Bruno Sammartino, he was like a legend in the Northeast, right? And, such a big draw there for a number of years. I don't think he maybe had the in-ring ability, but he certainly had the charisma. And box office ability, and how he could ignite fans, no matter who he was against, right? So he was certainly a classic in the Northeast. But I certainly think of guys like Dory and Terry Funk. Terry had kind of a shorter world title reign, and Harley Race, who added so much credibility to the world title, and could have consistently great matches everywhere they went, and uh, not only were big draws, but just provided so much stability and continuity in all the different cities they worked. Billy Robinson was just a phenomenal wrestler. More of a global star. Just his incredible matches in Japan and um, the AWA. But he had a great run in Stampede Wrestling, working for my dad. And was just a phenomenal wrestler. So those ones certainly come to mind. Hulk Hogan, you can't deny what a huge attraction he was. How he launched wrestling into a whole new era. With WrestleMania and his incredible drawing power. Against so many different guys. His incredible interviews. And uh, his box office appeal and charisma, and years later, guys like Stone Cold Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels. But I don't think they could have been as successful if it weren't for Hulkamania, right? So those are some of the landmark guys I can think of, but it's really hard to um, pinpoint one wrestler. But I certainly think Brett and Owen were right up there as just as phenomenal athletes and incredible performers, who had consistently great matches um, and did so much for the guys they wrestled against, and gave fans incredible matches night after night, and it would certainly, I think, be two of the most important Canadian contributions to the wrestling industry.
And when it comes to Stampede Wrestling, are the rights within the Hart family, or does WWE own them now?
Uh, I think WWE owns the Stampede shows, all the television shows. We sold the library to them about 25 years ago, which I kind of regret. I wish we could have hung on to them, but they had kind of promised they were going to showcase a lot of the shows on the new WWE network, and unfortunately that never happened. Not to the extent they should have. And I think they just had so many libraries they had accumulated from different promotions, right? They accumulated the world class library, the AWA library, of course the WCW library, and they have so much footage there they don't know what to do with. So it's disappointing that a lot of it never was shown. And they own the rights to it, right? And I doubt fans will get to see a lot of some of those great Stampede matches that we had, but occasionally you see it on YouTube. Somebody will post something, a real classic that they recorded on their VCR or something, and it's great and kind of refreshing to see a classic of the Stomper and my Brett, or my brother Brett, or Dynamite and Davey Boy, right, as opponents and as a tag team years later. And so, but we still basically own the trademark of Stampede Wrestling, and I think it's it's something that will always be there. It's always going to be a part of fans in Calgary and Alberta and Canada, and then just so many different wrestlers that had the opportunity to work here, and for people that got to see the TV show maybe on TSN or ESPN, and the different stars that came out of our promotion.
Ross, thank you so much for taking the time today, and thank you for your contributions for you and your family, within the wrestling industry. And again, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Joe. It was my pleasure. All the best to you, and we'll keep in touch.
Absolutely, Ross. For Ross Hart, I am Joseph Bruen, and this has been the All Access Entertainment Podcast. Don't forget to leave your comments, and we'd love to hear from you about this episode and future episodes, and we'll see you all next time.